year 1838, the governor of the state of Missouri issued an official government order, not an arrest warrant, not a fine, an extermination order. He literally commanded the citizens of his state to hunt down and kill an entire religious group on American soil. Men, women, and children. And nobody stopped him. Nobody tried. The United States federal government looked the other way. And here is the truly mind-bending part of the story. The people targeted by this order did not fight back with guns. They did not beg Congress for mercy. They did something far more audacious. They built a city, and then they abandoned it. And then they crossed a desert that even hardened frontiersmen called impassable. And on the other side of that desert, they built something the world had never seen. Inside the borders of the United States, a theocratic empire in the middle of nowhere, run by one man, answering to no government, defying the most powerful nation on earth. You think you know this story. You have probably heard the word Mormon before. Maybe you picture clean-cut young men knocking on your door with pamphlets. Maybe you picture polygamy scandals. Maybe you picture salt flats and temple spires. But what you almost certainly do not know is the full, raw, astonishing truth of what happened between 1830 and 1850. This is not a story about religion. Well, it is. But it is also a story about persecution, survival, political power, armed rebellion, and one of the most extraordinary mass migrations in the history of North America. By the end of this video, you will look at the American West differently. You will look at religious freedom differently. And you will ask yourself a question that has no easy answer. Was what the Mormons built a triumph of human will or a warning about what happens when faith becomes absolute power? Let us go back to the beginning. Not the religious beginning, not the theological origin story, but the human beginning. The story starts in upstate New York in the 1820s, in a time when America was drunk on revival. The Second Great Awakening was sweeping the country. Tent preachers thundered across the frontier. New denominations sprouted like weeds after rain. Every other preacher claimed direct access to God. Into this atmosphere of spiritual fever walked a young man named Joseph Smith. He was born in 1805 in Vermont, and by the time his family settled in western New York, he was already, by every account, an unusual person. Tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes, and a quality that people around him described again and again as magnetic. Neighbors who disliked him still admitted they could not stop listening when he talked. Joseph Smith grew up poor. His family scratched at rocky New England soil and never quite broke free from debt. But Joseph had an imagination that poverty could not contain. He was known locally as a treasure seeker, someone who claimed he could find buried gold and silver using special stones. This was not as crazy as it sounds to modern ears. In the 1820s, the idea of buried treasure left by ancient civilizations was widespread, especially in upstate New York, which was littered with mysterious earthworks that nobody could explain. Joseph charged neighbors small fees to help them search. He was, in today's terms, a gifted storyteller and a young man with an extraordinary ability to make people believe the impossible was real. Then, in 1827, Joseph Smith claimed something that changed everything. He said an angel named Moroni had led him to a hillside near his home in Manchester, New York, and shown him a set of golden plates buried in the earth. These plates, he said, were engraved with a record of ancient peoples who had lived in the Americas. And he, Joseph Smith, 21 years old, son of a poor farmer, had been chosen by God to translate them. He spent the next 2 years doing exactly that, sitting behind a curtain or a sheet with the plates hidden from view, dictating text to a series of scribes. In 1830, he published the result. He called it the Book of Mormon. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Joseph Smith was not just founding a new denomination. He was not tweaking the edges of Protestant theology. He was claiming that every existing Christian church on earth had gone fundamentally wrong. He was claiming that God the Father and Jesus Christ had appeared to him personally in a grove of trees when he was 14 years old and told him this directly. He was claiming that the Bible was incomplete, that a new scripture existed, that the original Church of Jesus Christ needed to be restored to the earth through him. In 1830, in a country that was already religiously volatile, these were not small claims. These were explosive claims, and they attracted followers at a speed that alarmed the neighbors almost immediately. By the time Joseph organized his church on April 6, 1830, he had a core group of believers. Within a year, that group had grown to hundreds. Within a few years, it had grown to thousands. People gave up their farms, their businesses, their family ties, and followed this young man. Why? Because Joseph Smith was extraordinary at something that is very hard to teach and impossible to fake entirely. He made people feel chosen. He made them feel that they were part of something cosmic and urgent, and he kept revealing new things, new doctrines, new scriptures, new commandments from God. His followers called him prophet, and they meant it with their whole hearts. The early church gathered, as Joseph instructed, first to Kirtland, Ohio, and then to western Missouri. Joseph had received a revelation, he said, that Missouri was the literal Garden of Eden, that Jackson County, Missouri, was the place where the New Jerusalem would be built, that the saints, as his followers called themselves, were to gather there and prepare for the second coming of Christ. So they came, by the hundreds, by the thousands. They bought land, they built homes, they established businesses, and the people who were already living in Missouri began to get very nervous, because Mormons voted as a bloc, because Mormons owned land together and traded among themselves, because Mormons were mostly from New England and did not share the Southern attitudes towards slavery that dominated Missouri, and because the Mormons openly said that God had given them Missouri, that the other settlers were temporary, that the land was theirs by divine right. You can imagine how well that went over. Missouri in the 1830s was rough frontier country. Armed mobs formed fast and disbanded fast. Violence was the default setting for disputes. In 1833, a mob drove the Mormons out of Jackson County with whips and rifles. Houses were burned. Men were beaten. Printing presses were destroyed. The Mormons fled north and tried to regroup. Joseph Smith attempted to lead a militia he called Zion's Camp, all the way from Ohio to rescue the displaced saints in Missouri. The march covered over 900 miles. It ended in failure when disease swept through the camp, and Joseph received a revelation telling him to stand down. His followers were devastated, but they stayed, because Joseph Smith could reframe any failure as a divine test. He was extraordinary at that, and his people loved him for it. The crisis finally exploded in 1838, and this is where the story becomes genuinely shocking to modern Americans. Governor Lilburn Boggs of Missouri issued what became known as Executive Order 44. In plain language, it read that the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. This was a legal government document, signed by a sitting governor, ordering the murder of American citizens based on their religion. Days later, a Missouri militia unit attacked a small Mormon settlement called Horm's Mill. 17 people died. A 9-year-old boy named Sardius Smith was found hiding under a bellows inside a blacksmith shop. A militiaman shot him in the head. When asked later why he had shot a child, he said it was right to nip him in the bud. Joseph Smith was captured, tried for treason, and sentenced to be executed by firing squad. Only the refusal of a general named Alexander Doniphan to carry out what he called a cold-blooded murder saved Joseph's life. The saints fled Missouri in the dead of winter. Thousands of people crossed the frozen Mississippi River into Illinois with almost nothing. They were destitute, they were traumatized, and they were still, every single one of them, absolutely convinced they were following a true prophet. That is the part that is so hard to wrap your head around, unless you understand what Joseph Smith had built. He had not just given these people a religion, he had given them an identity so complete, so all-encompassing, that losing it would mean losing themselves entirely. They were not just believers, they were the chosen people of God. And chosen people do not quit. They suffer, they endure, and they build again. Illinois welcomed the refugees, or at least, Illinois tolerated them. The state government saw a political opportunity in thousands of new voters. Joseph Smith had enormous charisma and political skill, and he negotiated a remarkable deal. The Saints were given a swampy, mosquito-infested bend in the Mississippi River, and they were granted a city charter with extraordinary powers of self-governance. Joseph called it Nauvoo. From a Hebrew word he said meant beautiful place, and beautiful it became. Within 5 years, Nauvoo grew from a swamp into one of the largest cities in Illinois, 20,000 people, a militia called the Nauvoo Legion that rivaled the Illinois State Military in size, a university, a newspaper, a temple under construction that would be, when finished, one of the most impressive buildings in the American West, and Joseph Smith as mayor, general, judge, and prophet all at once. This is where the story shifts. Because power does something to people, even prophets, especially prophets. In Nauvoo, Joseph Smith began revealing doctrines that even many of his loyal followers struggled to accept. He taught that God had once been a man, that men could become gods, that there were multiple gods, that eternal marriage was required for the highest level of heaven. These were radical departures from anything resembling mainstream Christianity, and they represented a bold, visionary theological system, unlike anything that had existed before in American religion. But the most explosive doctrine was the one he revealed privately first, and then could not fully contain. Plural marriage, polygamy. Joseph taught a small inner circle that God had commanded the restoration of an ancient biblical practice, that righteous men should take multiple wives, that this was necessary for the highest exaltation. The revelation on plural marriage tore through Nauvoo like a fault line. Some of Joseph's closest followers were horrified. His first wife, Emma, was furious. His second-in-command, William Law, broke away and published a newspaper denouncing Joseph as a fallen prophet and a tyrant. Joseph ordered the newspaper's printing press destroyed. This was a catastrophic mistake. Destroying a press was not just an act of censorship, it was a crime. Illinois citizens who had tolerated the Mormons for years suddenly had a concrete legal grievance. Joseph was arrested on charges of riot. He surrendered to authorities with what witnesses described as the calm of a man who knew his fate. On June 27, 1844, a mob stormed the jail at Carthage, Illinois. Joseph Smith was shot 4 times and fell from an upper-story window. He was 38 years old. The death of Joseph Smith should have ended everything. Every rational analysis of the situation would have predicted the collapse of the church. Movements built around charismatic founders almost always fragment and dissolve when the founder dies. And indeed, the church splintered. Multiple men claimed the right to lead the saints. Joseph's own brother William, a man named Sidney Rigdon, a charismatic figure named James Strang, who claimed an angelic letter of appointment and eventually led a colony on a Lake Michigan island where he was shot by his own followers. Any of these men might have prevailed in different circumstances, but then Brigham Young stood up to speak in the church square at Nauvoo, and something happened that his followers remembered for the rest of their lives as a miracle. People in the crowd said that as Brigham Young spoke, his voice changed. His face changed. He looked and sounded, they said, exactly like Joseph Smith. Whether this was a genuine supernatural event, a mass psychological response to grief and need, or a brilliant piece of unconscious theater on Brigham's part, nobody can say definitively. But the effect was decisive. The vast majority of the saints accepted Brigham Young as their new leader, and Brigham Young was, in many ways, even more formidable than the man he replaced. Where Joseph was visionary and spiritual, Brigham was organizational and ruthless. He was born in 1801 in Whittingham, Vermont, the ninth of 11 children of a poor family. He had almost no formal education. He had worked as a carpenter, a painter, and a glazier before joining the church in 1832. He was not magnetic in the way Joseph had been. He was blunt, sometimes brutal, and deeply practical. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost frightening, exactly what the Mormons needed to do next. They needed to leave. Not just Nauvoo, not just Illinois. They needed to leave the United States entirely. Because as long as they remained within the jurisdiction of American law, American mobs, American governors with extermination orders, they would never be safe. Brigham Young spent the months after Joseph's death planning one of the most audacious relocations in human history. He sent scouts west. He studied every available account of the territory beyond the Rockies. He corresponded with explorers. He read the journals of John C. Fremont, the Army officer who had mapped the Great Basin. Fremont described the Salt Lake Valley as barren, isolated, and almost entirely without agricultural potential. Most people read that as a warning. Brigham Young read it as a recommendation. Nobody would want the place. Nobody would come after them there. It was perfect. In February of 1846, the exodus began. Brigham Young could not wait for spring. Anti-Mormon violence in Illinois had reached a pitch that made delay impossible. The first wagons crossed the frozen Mississippi River in the middle of winter, carrying families who had sold everything they owned for whatever they could get. Some families walked away from homes they had built with their own hands, leaving behind furniture, tools, livestock, and decades of life. The procession that stretched across the Iowa Territory that winter and spring was staggering. 16,000 people, 3,000 wagons, 30,000 head of cattle and horses, one of the largest organized migrations in American history, moving through mud and sleet with no certain destination except a dot on a map that most of them had never seen. The crossing of Iowa nearly broke the migration before it had truly begun. The weather in the winter and spring of 1846 was appalling. Roads dissolved into rivers of mud. Wagons sank axle deep. Oxen died by the hundreds. Children died of exposure and disease. The Saints camped for months at winter quarters on the west bank of the Missouri River in what is now Nebraska, in rough huts and dugouts carved into the riverbank. The cold was savage. Scurvy spread through the camps. Hundreds died. A song they sang in those terrible months, "Come, Come Ye Saints," became the defining anthem of Mormon identity. Its words, written by a man named William Clayton, whose wife had just given birth back east while he trudged through Iowa snow. The melody was haunting. The lyrics were defiant. "All is well," they sang. "All is well." Brigham Young organized the migration at winter quarters with a military precision that was extraordinary for a civilian operation. He divided the emigrants into companies of hundreds, then into smaller groups of tens and 50s, each with a captain responsible for their welfare. He established rules for every aspect of trail life: when to rise, when to stop, how to arrange the wagons at night in a defensive circle, how to handle sickness, how to ration food. He was building, in the middle of a migration, the organizational skeleton of a new society. He selected an advance party of 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children to go first. The best men, the strongest men, the men he trusted. He called them the Pioneer Company, and he led them personally. The Pioneer Company left winter quarters on April 5, 1847. They traveled along the north bank of the Platte River, deliberately choosing a route that kept them separated from the main Oregon Trail, which ran along the south bank and was already crowded with westward moving settlers. Brigham did not want his people mixing with outsiders. He did not want trouble. He did not want competition for resources. He wanted a Mormon road, a road his people would follow by the thousands in the years to come. The company moved at a pace that averaged about 15 miles a day when conditions allowed, slower through mud and rain. They tracked their progress with an odometer, a device attached to a wagon wheel that Brigham had personally commissioned to measure exact distances. He wanted to know precisely how far it was from winter quarters to the valley, because thousands more would follow, and they would need to know exactly what they were getting into. The landscape changed dramatically as the Pioneer Company moved west. The lush grass of the Missouri River bottomlands gave way to the short grass plains of Nebraska, and then to the increasingly stark and dramatic terrain of Wyoming. They passed through the Black Hills. They crossed the Sweetwater River again and again. They climbed to South Pass, the great gap in the Rocky Mountains that made wagon travel possible, and stood at the Continental Divide, 7,500 feet above sea level. From here, water ran west. They were in the drainage of the Pacific now. Everything was different. The air was dry and brilliant. The peaks around them were still capped with snow in June. And ahead lay the final, brutal stretch. The crossing of the Wasatch Mountains into the valley of the Great Salt Lake. This is the moment where the story becomes almost mythological in the Mormon telling of it. On July 24, 1847, Brigham Young arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. He had been sick for most of the final approach, struck down by mountain fever, a tick-borne illness that left him lying in the back of a wagon, barely conscious, while his advance riders crested a hill and looked down at the valley below. When his wagon finally reached a point where he could see it, he raised himself up and looked out across the great flat expanse of desert ringed by mountains. The vast, pale shimmer of the Great Salt Lake to the northwest, the empty, sage-covered valley stretching for miles in every direction. And he said, in words that would be repeated by every Mormon child for the next 2 centuries, "This is the right place. Drive on." Think about what that valley looked like in July of 1847. It was not green and welcoming. It was not a promised land in any visual sense. It was hot. It was dry. The soil was alkaline and crusted. The Jordan River that ran through it was shallow and unreliable. The Great Salt Lake itself was utterly useless, too salty for drinking or irrigation. The nearest timber was miles away in the mountains. The nearest American settlement was Fort Bridger, 113 miles to the east. The nearest town of any size was Salt Lake City, which did not exist yet, because Salt Lake City was exactly what Brigham Young was about to build. In this place, on this impossible salt flat. With exhausted people and depleted wagons and no resources beyond what they had carried 1,800 miles on their backs. They started plowing the same day they arrived. Brigham Young had scouts locate the best available water source, a stream from the Wasatch Mountains that they called City Creek. Within hours, teams of men were digging irrigation ditches, turning the water across the parched soil before the sun went down on the first day. They planted potatoes immediately, even though they knew the harvest would be small and late. Because you plant what you have when you have it. Because every day of delay was another day the growing season slipped away. Because these were not tourists. They were colonists. They were builders. And they had a prophet who told them exactly what to do and exactly why it was going to work. And after everything they had survived, they believed him absolutely. Within weeks, the valley was transformed. Streets were laid out in a massive grid, blocks 10 acres square, reflecting Joseph Smith's original vision of a holy city. Every family received a plot of land. Water rights were communally managed under Brigham's direct control. He declared, in a statement that was simultaneously theological and political, that no man owned the land. The land belonged to God, and God had entrusted Brigham Young with its stewardship. This was not small government frontier individualism. This was something else entirely. This was a planned economy, a centrally directed community where the leader decided who got water and who got land, and where the roads went, and what got built first. And it worked. With stunning, almost unbelievable speed, it worked. By the end of 1847, a rudimentary city existed where there had been nothing. By 1848, thousands more saints were pouring over the mountains, following the route the Pioneer Company had blazed. By 1850, Brigham Young had laid formal claim to an enormous territory that he called Deseret, a word from the Book of Mormon meaning honeybee, signifying industry and cooperation. Deseret covered what is now Utah, Nevada, most of Arizona, parts of California, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, and New Mexico, her territory larger than many European nations. Brigham petitioned the United States Congress to admit Deseret as a state. He wrote the Constitution himself. He expected to govern it himself. And for a brief, extraordinary period, he essentially did. But here is the twist. Here is the thing that the standard textbook version of this story almost always leaves out. And it is the detail that changes everything you think you know about this whole saga. The United States government was not going to let the Mormons have their own country. Not after Mexico had ceded the Southwest to the United States following the Mexican-American War in 1848. Not when Congress could simply organize the territory and put a federal governor in charge. Congress refused statehood. They organized the territory of Utah instead, and in a gesture that was either diplomatic or cynical, they appointed Brigham Young as the first territorial governor. He was already running everything. The appointment just made it official. For a few years, because Washington eventually figured out what was actually happening in Utah Territory. Federal judges sent to Salt Lake City reported back to Congress that they had no power, that the courts were controlled by the church, that no Mormon would testify against another Mormon in any matter that touched on church interests, that Brigham Young was not a territorial governor who happened to also be a religious leader. He was a theocrat, running a religious state inside the boundaries of the United States, with his own legal system, his own militia, his own courts, and his own foreign policy. He had sent missionaries to England and Scandinavia, and they were recruiting converts by the thousands, bringing them to Utah on a church-organized immigration program that amounted to the largest sustained mass migration in American history. By 1856 alone, over 1,000 emigrants were crossing the plains pulling handcarts because they could not afford wagons. The handcart companies are their own tragedy inside the larger story. Brigham Young, always the pragmatist, always the organizer, calculated that wagons were expensive and slow, that handcarts, small two-wheeled vehicles a family could pull themselves, were cheaper and in some ways faster. He was right about the cost. He was catastrophically wrong about the timing. In 1856, two handcart companies, the Willie Company and the Martin Company, left too late in the season and were caught by early winter in Wyoming. The temperature dropped to well below zero. They had inadequate food and clothing. The Martin Company lost over 145 people out of roughly 500. The Willie Company lost 68. Survivors described burning their journals and wooden possessions for warmth, eating rawhide, watching friends and family freeze to death overnight. A rescue party sent by Brigham Young from Salt Lake City saved those who could be saved. The ones who survived remembered it for the rest of their lives as the defining test of their faith. And yet, they stayed. That is the thing that defies easy explanation. People who had lost children, parents, siblings, friends to the crossing of the plains. People who had been driven from 3 states at gunpoint. People who had watched their prophet murdered by a mob. These people stayed. They built. They planted. They prayed. They produced children and businesses and farms and temples. By 1857, Salt Lake City had a population of roughly 15,000. The territory had over 40,000 inhabitants. It had been settled faster, organized more efficiently, and survived more catastrophic challenges than almost any other American settlement of the era. And it was all, every bit of it, under the complete control of Brigham Young. Washington decided this had gone far enough. In 1857, President James Buchanan, facing political crises on every front and looking for something that would unite Americans across the slavery divide, declared that Utah Territory was in open rebellion against the United States government. He removed Brigham Young as territorial governor and sent 2,500 federal troops, roughly 1/6 of the entire standing United States Army, marching toward Salt Lake City. This became known as the Utah War, and it was one of the strangest military conflicts in American history because almost nobody died in it. Brigham Young, when he received word that an army was coming, did something brilliant. He did not fight he evacuated. Brigham ordered every Mormon in Salt Lake City to abandon their homes and move south. More than 30,000 people packed their possessions and left the city in a matter of weeks. They left the buildings standing, but prepared to burn everything if the federal troops attempted to occupy the city. Meanwhile, Mormon irregular fighters, the Nauvoo Legion under General Daniel Wells, harassed the federal supply lines, burning wagon trains and stampeding cattle. They did not attack soldiers directly. They froze the army in its tracks in Wyoming. The federal troops spent a miserable winter at a makeshift camp called Camp Scott, unable to advance, running low on supplies, with no clear orders and no understanding of the terrain or the enemy they faced. It was not a military humiliation exactly, but it was deeply embarrassing. The Utah War ended in negotiation, not battle. A presidential pardon was issued. A new federal governor, Alfred Cumming, was installed, though he had almost no real power. The federal troops eventually marched through a completely empty Salt Lake City, ostentatiously fulfilling their orders, and then camped 40 miles to the south, where they remained until the Civil War recalled them east. Brigham Young remained. His people returned to their homes. The temple construction resumed. The irrigation ditches kept flowing. The church continued to govern the territory in everything that mattered. The federal government had sent an army and accomplished essentially nothing. Brigham Young had faced down the United States military and won, but winning had a cost. And here is the darkest part of the story, the part that honest historians cannot skip over, and that Brigham Young's most devoted followers struggled with for generations. In September of 1857, exactly as the federal army was closing in on Utah from the east, a wagon train of emigrants from Arkansas passed through southern Utah on their way to California. They were not Mormons. They were outsiders, traveling through Mormon territory at the worst possible moment, when tensions were at their absolute peak, when Mormon militias were on war footing and deeply suspicious of any non-Mormon presence. At a place called Mountain Meadows, local Mormon militia members and their Paiute Indian allies attacked the wagon train. The emigrants fought back for 5 days from behind their wagons. Then, a militia leader named John D. Lee approached them under a flag of truce and promised them safe passage if they laid down their weapons. They surrendered. And then the militia shot them. 120 men, women, and children were killed. Only 17 small children were spared. It was a massacre. It was cold-blooded murder. And for 20 years, the church and its leaders refused to acknowledge the full truth of what had happened. John D. Lee was eventually excommunicated and, after 2 trials, executed by firing squad in 1877, sitting on his own coffin at the massacre site, the only man to face legal consequences for a killing carried out by dozens. Brigham Young denied ordering the massacre until his death. Historians have debated his direct culpability ever since. What is not debated is that the climate of paranoia and religious militancy that Brigham had cultivated made Mountain Meadows possible. That is a fact that no amount of faith or institutional pride can erase. So what do we make of all this? What is the final verdict on the Mormon exodus, on Brigham Young, on what the saints built in the desert? Here is the insight that took me deepest into this story, the thing I could not stop thinking about after reading every account, every memoir, every historical analysis I could find. The Mormons were simultaneously victims and oppressors. They were driven from Missouri at gunpoint by a government-sanctioned extermination order, one of the most grotesque violations of civil liberties in American history. And they were the same people who massacred 120 civilians at Mountain Meadows. They were refugees building a refuge, and in building that refuge, they replicated exactly the pattern they had fled, a community where religious authority was total, where dissent was dangerous, where outsiders were viewed with suspicion and sometimes with violence. Brigham Young died in 1877. By then, the Transcontinental Railroad had already arrived in Salt Lake City in 1869, connecting Utah to the rest of the country and making the isolation Brigham had worked so hard to maintain permanently impossible. The federal government kept pushing on polygamy, finally passing laws with real teeth in the 1880s that destroyed the church's economic and political structure. In 1890, the church officially renounced plural marriage. Utah was admitted as a state in 1896. The theocratic dream of Deseret was over. The temple Brigham had begun was finished in 1893, its spires visible for miles across the valley that his people had transformed from salt flat to city in less than half a century. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today has over 17 million members worldwide. Salt Lake City is a modern American metropolis. The story of the Mormon Exodus is taught in Utah schools as a founding narrative, a story of suffering and triumph, of faith against overwhelming odds. And all of that is true. It is a genuine story of human endurance that deserves every ounce of admiration it gets. 16,000 people crossed the American continent on foot and by wagon and survived a desert that experts said would kill them. They built a civilization in a place where civilization had no business being. By any measure, that is extraordinary. But extraordinary does not mean simple, and faith does not make every action righteous. The Mormons of the 1840s and 50s were some of the most impressive people in American history, and some of the most troubling. They were heroes of their own story, and at Mountain Meadows, villains in someone else's. They demanded religious freedom with every ounce of moral authority they possessed, and they built a community where religious conformity was enforced with social and sometimes physical violence. They crossed a desert to escape persecution and created, in that desert, a state that persecuted its own dissenters. This is not a reason to dismiss the miracle of what they built. It is a reason to look at it clearly, to hold the beauty and the darkness in the same hand, and refuse to put either one down. So here is the question I want to leave you with, the question I think about every time I look at the Salt Lake Temple, or read another account of the handcart companies, or the Mountain Meadows Massacre, or Brigham Young staring out over that empty valley and saying this is the right place. Was what the Mormons built in Utah a triumph of religious freedom? Or was it proof that any group, no matter how persecuted, no matter how genuine their suffering, carries the seed of the same intolerance they fled? Can you build a free community on absolute faith? Or does absolute faith always, eventually, demand absolute obedience? Write your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think, because this is the kind of question that does not have one right answer, and the conversation it starts is more interesting than anything I could say by myself. If this story made you see American history differently, if you want more episodes that go beyond the textbook version and into the real, complicated, astonishing truth of how this country was built, subscribe to Cradle of Democracy right now. We are telling the full story, not the sanitized version, not the myth, the thing that actually happened. And while you are here, check out our episode on the mountain men of the American West, the scouts and trappers who mapped the same territory the Mormons would cross and who lived lives so extreme they make the Pioneer Company look like a Sunday afternoon walk. It is right there, waiting for you. Click it. You will not regret it.